October 30th, 1993, Aragon Ballroom, Chicago. Kurt Cobain stood center stage, his pale fingers dancing across the strings of his battered Fender Mustang as Nirvana launched into Lithium, the song about mental medication and manic episodes that had become tragically prophetic of his own psychological struggles. The crowd of 20,000 was mesmerized, hanging on every note of the haunting melody that captured Kurt's bipolar emotional swings. Then, in the middle of the second verse, his guitar erupted in a shower of sparks and flames. What happened next would reveal the depths of Kurt Cobain's psychological fragility in ways that terrified his bandmates and left an entire arena in stunned silence. Now I'm going to tell you how one equipment malfunction triggered a mental breakdown that exposed Kurt's most vulnerable moments to the world. Lithium wasn't just another Nirvana track, as was Kurt Cobain's musical autobiography of mental illness written during his darkest period of depression and self-medication. The song's lyrics about finding happiness through chemical numbness reflected Kurt's own desperate attempts to stabilize his wildly fluctuating emotional states through drugs, both prescribed and illegal. By October 1993, Kurt's psychological condition had deteriorated significantly. The massive success of In Utero had intensified the pressure on his already fragile psyche, while his heroin addiction was spiraling out of control. His hypersensitive nature made every interview feel like psychological torture, every concert like an emotional minefield where one wrong moment could trigger a complete breakdown. That night in Chicago, Kurt was already on edge before taking the stage. His hands were shaking from withdrawal, his anxiety levels peaked from the overwhelming crowd energy, and his emotional state was as unstable as the song he was about to perform. The irony wasn't lost on him, performing a song about mental medication while struggling with his own psychological demons, using the very performance as a form of self-medication. The Aragon Ballroom was packed beyond capacity, the air thick with anticipation and the kind of manic energy that made Kurt's sensitive nervous system recoil. 20,000 faces stared up at him, each one expecting authenticity, expecting pain, expecting him to bleed his psychological wounds for their entertainment. The weight of their collective gaze felt like physical pressure against his already overwhelmed consciousness. Kurt had been having technical problems with his equipment all week. His guitar tech had warned him about electrical issues, intermittent shorts in the wiring that could cause problems during performance. But Kurt's perfectionist nature and artistic integrity wouldn't allow him to use backup instruments. This particular Fender Mustang had been with him through his most creative periods, and he felt psychologically connected to its sound in ways that transcended mere musical preference. As Nirvana opened their set with explosive energy, Kurt's emotional intensity was immediately visible to anyone who understood his psychological patterns. His guitar playing was more aggressive than usual, each chord struck with the violence of someone trying to exorcise demons through pure musical force. His voice carried a rawness that went beyond artistic expression. This was psychological purging set to rhythm. The crowd's response fed directly into Kurt's internal conflict, creating the familiar feedback loop of psychological torture that had become his daily existence. They cheered loudest when he seemed most broken, most vulnerable, as if his suffering was their validation that authentic pain could be transformed into beautiful art. But for Kurt, their worship felt like exploitation of his deepest wounds, confirmation that people loved his art more than they cared about his humanity. Dave Grohl watched Kurt from behind his drum kit with growing concern. After years of friendship and collaboration, Dave could read Kurt's psychological states like weather patterns, and tonight felt particularly dangerous. Kurt's usual stage presence was manic energy, barely containing deep sadness, but this performance felt different, more erratic, more unpredictable, like watching someone walk along the edge of a psychological cliff. When they began Lithium, the song that had made Kurt's mental health struggles public consumption, his emotional state became even more unstable. This wasn't just a performance, it was psychological exposure therapy conducted in front of 20,000 strangers, each note a reminder of his own mental fragility and chemical dependence. I'm so happy because today I found my friends. They're in my head, Kurt sang, his voice cracking with genuine emotion as the lyrics took on horrifying new meaning. The friends in his head weren't imaginary companions. They were the voices of depression, anxiety, and self-doubt that had been his constant psychological companions since childhood. As the song progressed, Kurt's guitar playing became increasingly intense, his fingers pressing harder against the strings, his strumming more violent, desperate. The Fender Mustang, already compromised by electrical problems, began showing signs of distress, small sparks from the pickups, crackling sounds through the amplification system, warning signs that something catastrophic was building. But Kurt was lost in the performance, channeling years of psychological pain through his instrument, using the music as both confession and exorcism. The same hypersensitivity that made his daily life unbearable now focused with laser intensity on every note, every chord, every emotional nuance of a song that had become too personal to perform safely. It happened during the second verse, at the exact moment Kurt sang the line about being locked up and won't let me go. His guitar, overwhelmed by electrical shorts, and the intensity of his playing erupted in a spectacular display of sparks, smoke, and actual flames. The explosion was so sudden and violent that it knocked Kurt backward, his hands instinctively releasing the instrument as it became a fireball in his grasp. For a split second, the arena fell into stunned silence. The music stopped abruptly as Dave and Chris realized something had gone catastrophically wrong. 20,000 people watched in shock as Kurt's beloved guitar burned on the stage floor, sending acrid smoke into the air and creating a scene that looked more like a rock and roll apocalypse than a concert performance. But the guitar explosion was only the beginning of what would become Kurt Cobain's most psychologically revealing public moment. Instead of calmly dealing with the equipment failure, instead of making a joke or calling for backup instruments, Kurt Cobain experienced what witnesses would later describe as a complete psychological breakdown in real time. The explosion seemed to trigger something deep in his traumatized psyche, as if the destruction of his instrument had somehow destroyed his last connection to emotional stability. Kurt dropped to his knees on the stage, staring at the burning guitar with an expression of absolute horror and devastation. But this wasn't just shock at equipment failure. This was the look of someone watching their entire world collapse, someone whose fragile psychological defenses had finally been overwhelmed beyond repair. No, 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 Kurt began whispering into his microphone, the words barely audible but picked up by the sensitive stage equipment. Not now, not here, please not here. His voice carried a desperation that went far beyond concern about a ruined performance. This was raw psychological terror, the sound of someone's mental barriers completely collapsing. What happened next shocked everyone who witnessed it and would become one of the most discussed psychological episodes in rock history. Kurt Cobain, still on his knees beside the burning guitar, began talking to the destroyed instrument as if it were a living being, as if its destruction had somehow killed a part of himself. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Kurt whispered to the charred remains of his Fender, his voice thick with tears and genuine grief. I should have protected you better. I should have known this would happen. The crowd watched in uncomfortable silence as their rock hero conducted a funeral service for an inanimate object, revealing depths of psychological fragility that no one had imagined. Dave Grohl later described the moment as watching Kurt's soul break in real time. The intensity of Kurt's emotional response to the guitar's destruction was so disproportionate, so psychologically raw, that it became clear this wasn't about equipment failure. This was about a man whose mental state was so fragile that any disruption could trigger complete emotional collapse. Kurt's relationship with his instruments wasn't normal musical attachment, it was psychological dependence. His guitars were extensions of his troubled psyche, the only reliable vehicles for expressing the emotional chaos that constantly churned inside his hypersensitive consciousness. Watching his primary creative outlet literally explode and burn triggered every abandonment issue, every fear of loss, every traumatic memory that Kurt had been suppressing through drugs and performance. "The music is gone," Kurt said into the microphone, his voice now carrying a hollow despair that made the entire arena uncomfortable. "Everything I am, everything I feel, it's all gone now. How am I supposed to tell you what's inside me without my voice?" The psychological symbolism was devastating and obvious to everyone present. Kurt wasn't just talking about his guitar, he was talking about his ability to communicate his deepest emotions, his fear that without his music he would be trapped alone with his psychological demons, unable to reach the outside world or connect with other human beings. Chris Novoselic tried to approach Kurt with a replacement guitar, but Kurt recoiled from the instrument as if it were physically threatening. "That's not mine," he said, with genuine terror in his voice. "That doesn't know me, that doesn't understand what I need to say. How can I sing about my mind with something that doesn't know my mind?" The crowd was now witnessing something unprecedented in concert history, is a complete psychological breakdown disguised as concern about musical equipment. Kurt's emotional state had deteriorated so rapidly that he was no longer capable of distinguishing between his internal psychological reality and the external world of performance and entertainment. As venue staff worked to clear the burned guitar debris and Kurt remained kneeling center stage, his psychological episode took an even more disturbing turn. He began scanning the crowd with wide, frightened eyes, as if seeing threats that nobody else could detect. "Someone did this," Kurt announced to the stunned audience, his voice carrying the paranoid certainty of someone whose grip on reality was slipping. "Someone wanted this to happen. Someone wanted to take away my voice, wanted to silence what I have to say." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from the destroyed guitar. Kurt's bandmates exchanged worried glances as they recognized the signs of the paranoid episodes that had been increasing in frequency and intensity over the past months. Kurt's drug use and psychological pressure had been feeding a growing conviction that people were actively working against him, plotting to destroy his career and his sanity. "I can see you out there," Kurt continued, pointing randomly into the crowd of 20,000 confused and increasingly uncomfortable fans. "I can see your faces. I know what you're thinking. You want me broken, you want me crazy, you want me to fail so you can feel better about your own lives." The psychological projection was obvious to mental health professionals who later analyzed video footage of the incident, but to the fans present that night, it was simply terrifying. Their vulnerable hero was accusing them of sabotage, turning their worship into a perceived threat, transforming their support into imagined persecution. Dave Grohl made the decision to end the performance, but Kurt refused to leave the stage. "I can't go," he said, with genuine panic in his voice. "If I leave now, they win. If I stop playing, the voices in my head get louder. The music is the only thing that keeps them quiet, and now the music is dead." The admission that Kurt was hearing voices was the most public acknowledgement he'd ever made of his deteriorating mental state. The same hypersensitivity that made his songwriting so emotionally powerful was now manifesting as auditory hallucinations, internal voices that criticized and tormented him when external stimulation wasn't available to mask them. What followed was an impromptu psychological intervention conducted on stage in front of 20,000 witnesses. Kurt's guitar, tech, sound engineers, and eventually Dave Grohl himself worked together to convince Kurt that his paranoid fears weren't real, that the guitar explosion had been a simple equipment failure, not sabotage. "Kurt, listen to my voice," Dave said gently, approaching his friend like someone trying to calm a frightened animal. "Remember where you are. Remember who you're with. We're your friends. We love you. And nobody here wants to hurt you." The guitar failed because guitars sometimes fail, not because anyone wanted to hurt you. Kurt's response revealed the depth of his psychological deterioration. But what if I can't trust my own perceptions anymore? What if my mind is so broken that I can't tell the difference between what's real and what's in my head? What if I'm going crazy and everyone can see it except me? The question hung in the arena air like a confession, exposing Kurt's deepest fear about his own mental stability. The same artistic sensitivity that had made Nirvana's music so emotionally resonant had become a liability, making Kurt question his own psychological reality and fear that his mental illness was visible to everyone around him. Eventually, Kurt allowed himself to be led off stage, but not before making one final statement that would haunt everyone present. The music was the only thing holding me together, and now it's gone. I don't know how to be Kurt Cobain without my guitar. I don't know how to be anyone at all. The Chicago incident became a turning point in Kurt Cobain's public image and personal psychological journey. Footage of his breakdowns circulated among Nirvana's inner circle, and while it was kept from mainstream media, the incident forced everyone close to Kurt to confront the severity of his mental health crisis. Kurt himself struggled to remember details from the incident, later telling his therapist that the entire episode felt like watching someone else have a nervous breakdown while being trapped inside their body. The psychological dissociation suggested that Kurt's mental state had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer maintain consistent connection to his own identity during moments of extreme stress. The story of Kurt Cobain's guitar explosion and subsequent breakdown reveals something profound about the relationship between artistic genius and mental illness. Kurt's hypersensitivity, which made his music so emotionally authentic, also made him psychologically vulnerable in ways that proved ultimately destructive. The incident demonstrates how quickly artistic performance can become psychological exposure therapy for someone with untreated mental illness. Kurt wasn't just playing music, he was conducting public examinations of his own psychological wounds, using concert performances as a form of self-medication that became increasingly dangerous as his mental state deteriorated. The image of Kurt Cobain kneeling beside his burning guitar, conducting a funeral service for an inanimate object while 20,000 people watched in stunned silence, remains one of the most psychologically revealing moments in rock history. It captured everything tragic about his character: the hypersensitivity that made him brilliant, the emotional fragility that made him vulnerable, and the artistic integrity that made him unable to fake psychological states he wasn't actually experiencing.